Darth Vitiate. If immortality had a face in Star Wars, it would look like him. They say monsters are made, not born. Well, I'd look at this guy and think again. A child who murdered his own father at age 10, a Sith who drained an entire planet dry, a conqueror who ruled from the shadows for over 1,000 years. This is the story of the most dangerous and powerful Sith to ever exist. Okay, it is 5113 BBY, and on a pretty unremarkable agricultural world called Medrias, a child is born. His name is Tenebrae. His mother is a poor farmer's wife. His father is Lord Dramath, a Sith Lord who rules the planet with the kind of cruelty you'd expect from a guy whose main hobby is apparently terrorizing his subjects. Dramath is powerful, ruthless, and absolutely not winning any Father of the Year awards. He also apparently didn't stay loyal to anyone because Tenebrae is born illegitimate. Dramath didn't even know about him at first. This kid from birth was built different. He never cried, not even as a newborn, and when he finally started talking, his voice carried a weight and a power that simply should not come from a child. People didn't want to be around him, even his mother, who by all accounts was already being abused and broken down by Dramath, found her own child difficult to be near. By age 6, Tenebrae was already using the Force instinctively. Most Force-sensitive kids need training, structure, need someone to show them the way. This kid figured it out on his own at 6 years old, with zero guidance, on a backwater farming planet at the edge of the Sith Empire. That alone should tell you something. Now, was this kid born evil, or was he made evil? Because on one hand, look at the environment. His mother was abused. His father was a Sith Lord who ruled through cruelty and fear. He grew up in a household defined by violence and power dynamics. That kind of thing warps people. We know that, and there's a reasonable argument to be made that a Force-sensitive child raised in that environment, they might develop in a really dark direction. But on the other hand, he was never broken by it. By the time he's 10 years old, rumours start spreading across the northern continent of Medrias about a child gathering power. People who went to investigate for Lord Dramath didn't come back. Dramath eventually sends envoys. They don't return either. And finally, Dramath himself shows up, because this is his planet, and some child is not going to make him look weak in front of his subjects. Now Lord Dramath, a full-grown Sith Lord with decades of experience, and presumably a healthy ego about his own power, rides out to confront a 10-year-old boy. In front of the court, his plan is probably to assess the kid, maybe drag him back, maybe just execute him if he's a threat. Easy enough, right? Tenebrae had other plans. Tenebrae stripped Dramath of the Force. He spent his last moments weeping in terror, staring up into his son's black eyes. And then Tenebrae killed him. He imprisoned Dramath's Force spirit in a Sith holocron. He built a cage for his father's consciousness and then moved on with his day. And he was just 10 years old. And the mother? She died sometime during this period too. Tenebrae later built his palace on the exact site where their childhood home stood. The place where he was raised in poverty and violence. He tore it down and built himself a throne on the rubble. Now you might think, okay, the court sees all of this, they're terrified, they fall in line. And some of them do, but the Sith Empire has plenty of ambitious lords, and when word spreads that Dramath is dead and a child is sitting on his throne, several of them decide to try their luck. One after another, powerful Sith come to claim the unoccupied seat of power on Medrias, and one after another, they fall. Every single one. Each victory makes Tenebrae stronger. Each death feeds him, shapes him, refines him. It takes 3 years to fully consolidate his control over the planet. 3 years for a kid who goes from 10 to 13 during this stretch, methodically dismantling every challenge to his rule. Dramath's firstborn son, Tenebrae's half-brother, looks at all of this, makes the arguably wise decision that valor is not worth dying for, and flees the planet entirely. He ends up on a moon called Rekiad, where he lives out the rest of his days hiding from his little brother. Tenebrae is 13 years old, and he is the undisputed ruler of Medrias, an entire Sith world conquered and controlled by a teenager who started with nothing, with no master or training, and with an intellect and a hunger that neither his environment nor the galaxy around him was prepared for. And that brings us to the question we started with. Born evil or made evil? I think Tenebrae came into the world already something different. The environment shaped the direction, sure. It confirmed for him early that power was the only real language, that cruelty was what rulers used, that no one was coming to protect or save him. But the capacity for what he became? The complete absence of anything resembling normal human attachment. I think that was already there. The darkness didn't build Tenebrae. Tenebrae built himself using the darkness as the only tool he had. And this is just the beginning. Because we're still at age 13, he's got 1,500 years left in front of him. And things are about to get so much worse. It is 5,100 BBY, and the natural question at that point is, okay, what does a child conqueror do next? The answer, if you're Tenebrae, is that you get to work. The thing about Tenebrae that separates him from basically every other power-hungry figure in this universe, he was never impulsive, he was never reactive. While most Sith are all emotion, all passion, all, I want this and I want it now, Tenebrae operated like someone who had already seen how the story ends and was just walking toward it. At 13 years old, he had the long-term strategic thinking of someone 5 times his age, and the ambition to match. So he takes Medrias, and he renames it Nathema. And it's his first major act of erasure. The planet had a history, a culture, people who lived there for generations. By renaming it, he's already starting the process of replacing everything that existed before him with himself. It's a small thing on the surface, but it tells you everything about how this guy thinks. The world doesn't have an identity, he is its identity now. His rule over Nathema is what you'd expect given everything we already know about him. Fear is the primary currency. Absolute obedience is the only acceptable response to any command. There's no council, no advisors with actual power, no structure that exists independently of his will. Everyone beneath him exists either to serve or to be used. And in Tenebrae's mind, those two things aren't even that different. Where it gets genuinely fascinating, Tenebrae doesn't sit on a throne and collect tribute like a standard Sith warlord would. That's too boring for him, too small. He starts experimenting. Nathema becomes a laboratory. His subjects, the actual living people on this planet, become his test subjects. He's researching the dark side, probing its limits, trying to understand what it can and can't do at a fundamental level. And the people are data, material. He approaches them the way a scientist approaches lab rats, except lab rats at least don't have to watch you write notes about them. Now, Sith experiments on people and kind of gloss over it as generic Star Wars villainy. This is different. This isn't torture for cruelty's sake. It's not punishment. It's not even about control in the traditional sense. Tenebrae is genuinely curious about the mechanics of the Force, specifically the dark side, and specifically what happens when you push it to its absolute limit. He wants to know where the ceiling is. And his hypothesis, which he's already forming at this age, is that there might not be one. Not if you're willing to pay the right price. What is the right price? Other people's lives, obviously. Never his own. That's a consistent theme throughout his entire existence. Tenebrae never pays the price himself. Someone else always does. The experiments on Nathema's population during this period are documented in Sith records as being particularly extreme. We're talking about dark side rituals that killed entire villages, Force techniques that were essentially uncharted territory even by Sith standards at the time. He's not following any existing playbook, he's writing his own. And he's doing all of this before he's even old enough to shave his balls. He starts cultivating a cult of personality around himself on Nathema that goes beyond normal Sith lordship. He's not presenting himself as a ruler, he's presenting himself as something categorically different. The message is essentially, I am not your lord, I am your god, and people believe it. Because what other framework do you use when a 13-year-old boy has already killed everyone who challenged him, is performing rituals that defy comprehension, and seems to experience no fear whatsoever? The normal categories stop applying pretty quickly. When your ruler feels nothing, and everything he does works, every time, without exception, at some point the logical conclusion your brain reaches is that this isn't a person. That reputation spreads. And in the Sith Empire, reputation travels fast. Here's the political context you need to understand. The Sith Empire, at this point, is under the rule of Marka Ragnos. If you know anything about this era of Star Wars lore, you know that name. Marka Ragnos is widely considered one of the most powerful and cunning Sith Lords who ever lived. He ruled the Empire for over a century. Under his reign, the Sith were at a kind of golden age. Powerful, organised, and terrifyingly competent. This is a genuinely elite ruler of an empire, and he's heard about the child on Nathema. This man has seen everything the Sith Empire has to offer. He's watched countless ambitious lords rise and fall. He's navigated a century of Sith politics, which, if you know anything about how Sith politics work, is essentially like defusing a bomb every single day while surrounded by people trying to push you onto it. For something to catch his eye specifically, it has to be unusual. Tenebrae is unusual. The reports coming out of Nathema are enough that Marka Ragnos decides he wants to see this for himself. So he summons Tenebrae to appear before him. This is a 13-year-old child being summoned before the ruler of an entire empire. Most people in that position would be terrified. Most grown adults in that position would be terrified. The appropriate response to being summoned before Marka Ragnos is probably some combination of gratitude and controlled panic. Tenebrae shows, looking at the most powerful Sith in the galaxy, the way you'd look at an interesting piece of furniture. SWTOR is not a friendly place. It's cold, dark, heavy with the dark side. The kind of planet where the atmosphere itself feels like it's watching you. And the court of Marka Ragnos is not very welcoming hall, where you bring your grievances and get a fair hearing. This is the seat of a man who fought his way to the top in a system specifically designed to produce the most brutal survivors possible, and then held that position for 100 years by being smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than literally everyone around him. Walking into that court uninvited is, by any reasonable measure, a death wish. Tenebrae walked in anyway, and the specific detail I love, according to the Wikipedia lore and the Revan novel, he came to ask for two things: recognition as the ruler of Medrias, and training in the Sith arts. He came asking to be trained, which means at 13, despite everything he'd already taught himself, despite already being powerful enough to strip a Sith Lord of the Force and kill him with zero formal instruction, he still recognized there were things he didn't know yet. He came to the most powerful Sith alive and essentially said, "I want more, teach me." That kind of self-awareness combined with that level of raw power is rare. Most people that powerful at that age think they already know everything. Tenebrae knew he didn't. That's actually the scariest thing about him. It wasn't arrogance driving him, it was hunger for knowledge, and those are two very different engines. Now what does Marka Ragnos do? He looks at this 13-year-old, he reads the room. He sees what's in front of him, a child who conquered a planet, killed a Sith Lord, displayed command of the Force that simply should not be possible at his age, and somehow did all of it without a master, without guidance, drawing purely on instinct and intelligence. And Ragnos makes a decision. He declines to take him as an apprentice, but he grants both requests. He gives Tenebrae official recognition as ruler of Medrias. He elevates him to the rank of Sith Lord, and he gives him a new name. From this moment forward, the boy from the backwater farming world is Lord Vitiate. Now why did Ragnos say no to the apprentice part? The lore doesn't give us a clean answer on that, but if I had to read between the lines, and this is me speculating based on everything we know about both characters, I think Ragnos looked at Tenebrae and recognized something he couldn't control. Taking on an apprentice is a power move in Sith culture, but it also creates proximity. It creates a relationship, and whatever Ragnos saw in that 13-year-old's black eyes, I think he was sharp enough to understand that this was not something you wanted close. You recognize it. You give it what it wants for now. You keep it at arm's length, and you watch it from a distance. The fact that Ragnos was smart enough to see that is kind of impressive, actually. He was one of the few people in this entire story who interacted with Tenebrae and made a reasonably sensible decision about it. Most people either tried to fight him and died, or underestimated him and died. Ragnos essentially went, "Yeah, no, here's your title, go be a problem somewhere else. Respect." So Vitiate, and from here on we're calling him Vitiate, because that's who he is now, returns to Nathema with something he didn't have before. Imperial backing, official legitimacy, the stamp of the most powerful Sith in the galaxy, saying, "This is a real Sith Lord, this world is his, don't touch it." Which in practical terms means that while the rest of the Sith Empire is playing its constant game of backstabbing and power grabs and political maneuvering, Nathema is off the board. Nobody moves on Vitiate's territory because nobody wants to explain to Marka Ragnos why they did. And Vitiate uses that protection exactly the way you'd expect. He disappears into his work. For the next 100 years, Vitiate does almost nothing politically visible. He doesn't campaign. He doesn't forge alliances. He doesn't expand his territory. He doesn't position himself for succession when Ragnos eventually dies. By the standards of Sith politics, where ambition is the entire point, he looks like a total non-factor. What Vitiate was actually doing for those 100 years is one of the most impressive and terrifying intellectual undertakings in Star Wars lore. He was building a framework. He was studying ancient Sith texts, forbidden rituals, obscure dark side techniques that other Sith had either never found or found, and walked away from because the implications were too extreme even for them. He was essentially cataloguing everything the dark side could do, and then extrapolating. If this technique does this, and that technique does that, what happens when you combine them at a scale nobody has ever tried? His specific obsession during this period is immortality. He's approaching immortality like an engineering problem. He wants to understand the mechanics of it. What exactly is life force? What happens to it when someone dies? Can it be redirected? Can it be absorbed? Can you essentially steal someone else's connection to the force itself and add it to your own? And if you can do that with one person, what happens if you do it with 100, 1,000, an entire planet? He's drawing blueprints. Early in his reign, young Sith actually flocked to Nathema to learn from him. He had followers. He was teaching. And what was he teaching them? Restraint, control of emotion, drawing on inner anger rather than letting it control you. Which, if you know anything about Sith doctrine, is actually a fairly sophisticated position. Most Sith lean into passion and instinct. Vitiate was teaching something colder and more controlled. He was, perhaps not deliberately, but effectively, producing a generation of Sith who operated more like him. Disciplined and patient, less prone to the reckless impulsiveness that gets most Sith killed. And then, after using them as both students and presumably as additional test subjects for his research, he just stopped engaging with them. The doors on Nathema closed, the visits stopped, the political profile went to zero. Ragnos dies in 5000 BBY. Immediately, the Sith Empire fractures. Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh start the succession crisis that will eventually lead to the Great Hyperspace War. Every ambitious Sith in the galaxy is either picking a side or trying to exploit the chaos. It's exactly the kind of moment a politically minded Sith Lord would use to make a move, grab more territory, align with the winning side, increase influence. He watches, waits, and keeps studying. And while everyone around him is running toward the noise, he is the only one in the entire Sith Empire asking the right question, which is not who wins the succession, but what happens after. He understood, in a way that apparently nobody else did, that the Sith Empire was about to overreach, that whatever happened with Sadow and Kresh, the ambition was going to outpace the preparation. And when empires overreach, they collapse. And when this one collapsed, there would be a moment where the right person with the right plan could offer something and get literally everything in return. He's been building toward that moment for 100 years. He knows exactly what he's going to offer, and he knows exactly what it's actually going to cost. Two lords step up to claim the throne. They start dueling for the Dark Lordship at Ragnos' own funeral, which, credit where it's due, is an extremely Sith way to handle a succession. You could not make that up. Sadow wins the political maneuvering. He manipulates the situation, uses a pair of Republic explorers who accidentally stumbled into Sith space, siblings named Gav and Jory Darragon, as the catalyst he needs. He convinces the Sith Council that the Republic is already aware of them, already preparing to invade, and that the only option is to strike first. It's a masterclass in manufacturing consent. The Council buys it. Sadow gets his war. And so begins the Great Hyperspace War. Sith fleets pour into Republic space. They hit Coruscant. They hit the Koros system. Early on, things actually go pretty well for the Sith. The Republic is caught off guard. The aggression of the assault creates chaos, and Sadow's battle meditation is genuinely formidable. For a moment, it looks like the Sith might actually pull this off. Then it collapses, and it collapses fast. Gav Darragon, the Republic explorer Sadow had been using as a pawn, has a change of heart mid-battle at Koros Major. He abandons the Sith forces he was commanding, turns against Sadow, and gets the Republic the astrogation data they need to track the Sith fleet back home. Without his battle meditation focused and with his own manipulations unraveling, SWTOR's forces start falling apart. The Republic drives them out. They chase the Sith fleet all the way back down the Darragon Trail to Korriban itself. SWTOR returns to find Kresh has reclaimed the Empire in his absence. They fight. SWTOR kills Kresh, but at enormous cost. Both fleets decimated, the Sith military in absolute ruins. And then the Republic shows up at Korriban anyway and finishes the job. SWTOR fakes his death and flees to Yavin 4. The Republic and Jedi systematically dismantle what's left of the Sith Empire. Korriban falls, the Sith worlds are invaded. The civilization that had been building for centuries is, within what feels like the span of a single catastrophic year, effectively destroyed. There are reports of famine, disease, ritual mass suicides among the remaining Sith populations during the Republic counter-invasion. The Stygian caldera, the heart of Sith territory, is overrun. It is, by any measure, a complete and total annihilation. So while everyone else is running toward the chaos, Vitiate is at home refining his plan. The experiments on Nathema continue. The research into dark side immortality deepens. He is, at this point, probably the most powerful individual Sith Lord alive, and absolutely nobody is paying attention to him, which is exactly how he wants it. The Republic counter-invasion grinds through Sith territory, and the remaining Lords watch everything they've built get systematically destroyed. The survivors start doing the math. Their armies are gone. Their homeworlds are burning. Korriban, the spiritual center of Sith civilization, has fallen. There is no organized resistance left, and the Republic isn't stopping. Supreme Chancellor Pultimo has authorized a full counter-invasion, the explicit goal being to wipe out the Sith completely. Desperate, broken, with nowhere left to turn, the surviving Sith Lords start looking for options, and Vitiate, who has been sitting quietly on Nathema for 100 years, with Imperial backing and untouched territory, and a reputation as the most terrifyingly powerful recluse in the Empire, starts making himself known, very carefully. His offer is simple. I have a ritual. I have a way to save us all. I can give us the power we need to survive this, to come back, to eventually have our revenge on the Republic. These are Sith Lords, proud, arrogant, deeply convinced of their own superiority. Under normal circumstances, accepting help from another Sith is seen as weakness. It invites attack, it creates debt. The Sith don't do vulnerability, but these aren't normal circumstances. These people have watched their empire collapse in real time. They've seen their masters killed, their homeworlds invaded, everything they knew dismantled. The pride is still there, but survival instinct is louder, and Vitiate is offering exactly the right thing: power, a ritual of power, something that frames accepting his invitation as a strategic choice rather than an admission of defeat. And it works. The Sith Lords start coming to Nathema. 8,000 Sith Lords on one planet. 8,000. At the height of the Sith Empire's power, that's essentially the entire surviving Force-sensitive population of a civilization. Generals, scholars, warriors, sorcerers, people who had survived the Great Hyperspace War, the Republic counter-invasion, the collapse of everything they'd ever known. The best and most dangerous the Sith had left. And every single one of them travelled to Nathema because Vitiate asked them to. That right there should already be raising flags for you, because since when do Sith Lords do what anyone asks? Sith don't show to someone else's party unless they're planning to take over. These are not cooperative people. These are not team players. And yet 8,000 of them looked at Vitiate's invitation and said yes. He made public speeches. He broadcast messages throughout what remained of the Empire with graphic, terrifying descriptions of what the Jedi and Republic would do to them if they didn't unite. He painted the picture of total extinction. Your culture, your bloodline, your legacy, everything the Sith ever built, wiped out completely. Together we survive. When the Sith Lords arrived on Nathema, Vitiate moved immediately. Before anyone could assess the situation, before any of them could form coalitions or start the inevitable scheming, he hit them all at once. The mind domination was instantaneous and total. 8,000 Force-sensitive individuals, trained in resisting mental influence, crushed simultaneously. Their will gone, their identities gone. Slaves in an eye blink to the one mind that had been building toward this moment for over 100 years. This was the most complex act of Sith sorcery ever attempted in recorded history, and Vitiate had an ace up his sleeve that nobody knew about. He'd secretly had researchers locate an ancient superweapon, a machine called Zildrog, specifically designed for the transfer of life energies. He was using technology to amplify and channel the ritual on a scale that wouldn't have been physically possible otherwise. The ritual took 10 days. 10 days. And during those 10 days, Vitiate used the 8,000 enslaved Sith Lords as both fuel and conduit. Their power, their life force, their connection to the Force itself, all of it channeled and directed into him. But the Sith Lords were just the eye of the storm, as the records describe it. The ritual didn't stop with them. It spread outward across the entire planet like a wave. Every man, woman and child on Nathema, every animal, every bird, every fish, every insect, every plant, every living thing touched by the Force, consumed, all of it pulled into Vitiate and absorbed. The planet lost the Force entirely. The Force is described as an energy field binding all living things together. It exists on every inhabited world in the galaxy because life creates it. When you drain every living thing of its Force connection, you create a void, a wound in the fabric of reality itself. Colour seemed to leach out of everything, leaving the surface in sickly browns and greys. The sun itself looked brown through the warped atmosphere, and the bodies of Nathema's inhabitants remained exactly where they fell, perfectly preserved, because there was nothing left alive to decompose them. The only species that partially survived were the Voraclaw, semi-sentient insectoid bipeds who lived underground. Their hive mind was obliterated by the ritual, leaving them completely mindless. With nothing left to eat, they turned on each other. Vitiate eventually captured the last few survivors and studied them, because of course he did. When the 10 days ended, Vitiate stood alone on a dead world, the only living thing on an entire planet. He had killed millions. He had consumed 8,000 Sith Lords. He had created a void in the Force that would persist for over 1,300 years. And in return, he had gained functional immortality and a connection to the dark side that made every other Force user in existence look like they were working with a candle next to his bonfire. He was no longer Lord Vitiate. That name was too small for what he'd become. From this moment, there was only one title that fit: the Emperor. After the ritual, Vitiate had a problem, specifically the Sith who didn't attend. Some had refused the invitation. Some were simply off-world during the gathering. These survivors would eventually find out what happened on Nathema, and Vitiate consumed 8,000 of your colleagues is not a great recruitment pitch for building a new empire. So, he made a move. He blamed the Jedi. He told the remaining Sith that Nathema was destroyed by Republic forces. He turned the single greatest atrocity he personally committed into a propaganda tool, using the shock and horror of a dead world to fuel anti-Republic sentiment and loyalty to himself. The lie worked perfectly. The Jedi couldn't exactly prove a negative, and the Sith were already primed to believe the worst of their enemies. And then he went further. While that story circulated, Vitiate had a secret research team that had been quietly locating the hidden world of Dromund Kaas, a dark side-saturated planet deep in the unknown regions that had been lost to galactic records for centuries. When the ritual was done, he destroyed that research team too. Every person who knew the location of Dromund Kaas outside of his own mind eliminated. He was the only one left with that knowledge, which meant that the surviving Sith, if they wanted to follow him to safety, had absolutely no choice but to follow him personally, on his timeline, on his terms. He became indispensable. He engineered a situation where the people he needed to rebuild an empire had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, and no information he hadn't personally chosen to give them. The galaxy outside had no idea any of this had happened. As far as the Republic was concerned, the Sith were a broken, scattered remnant fleeing into the darkness, which was true. They just had no idea what was leading them into that darkness, or what it had just become. So at this point in the story, Vitiate has done the ritual. He's consumed an entire planet. He's functionally immortal, more powerful than any Force user alive, and he's leading the surviving Sith remnants toward Dromund Kaas to rebuild. On paper, things are going exactly according to plan. But the problem with becoming a dark side entity of almost incomprehensible power, you develop a side effect, a pretty significant one. Being around Vitiate in person, in his original body, starts doing things to people's minds. Extended exposure to his true presence destabilizes people psychologically. His aura is so saturated with dark side energy, so fundamentally wrong in the way that Nathema is blank. People in his immediate presence becoming essentially shells. That's a practical problem if you're trying to run an empire. You can't hold court, you can't receive reports, you can't govern if everyone in the room with you is slowly losing their mind. He solves it by deciding he simply won't be in the room anymore. The concept of the Emperor's voice is one of the most unsettling power structures in Star Wars lore, and I don't think it gets nearly enough attention. He selects a host, a living person, typically someone strong enough in the Force to survive the process without immediately burning out, and he possesses them completely. The host's consciousness is submerged entirely, their personality gone, their will gone, their identity erased, and then he operates the body like a vehicle, speaking through it, ruling through it, using it to interact with the world, while his true self remains hidden and protected. The hosts varied widely throughout the centuries. The gender changed, the age changed, but one thing never changed: the voice. Every single voice, regardless of the body it was operating through, spoke with the exact same voice. Emotionless, cold, that deep, resonant, almost harmonic quality that the Revan novel describes as sounding like multiple voices layered in perfect unison. As if the body was just a speaker and something much larger was talking through it. Now the layer on top of that, the voices weren't only a security measure. They were also disposable by design, because Vitiate dark side energy, even filtered through a host body, is corrosive. The possession accelerates aging. It burns through the host's physiology at a rate no human or Sith body can sustain indefinitely. The voices age faster than they should. They develop deterioration, and eventually they die, just from the sustained burden of containing that much dark side power in a normal body. When a voice died, there was an entire infrastructure in place to handle it. The Emperor's hand, 12 specially conditioned servants, who operated as Vitiate's most trusted intermediaries, would receive his essence, essentially catch him when the host expired, and then go find a new one. They'd procure a suitable candidate, prepare them, and facilitate the transfer. Rinse and repeat. New body, same voice, same presence, same emperor. The Sith Empire went through multiple voices over the centuries, and most regular Imperials had absolutely no idea this was happening. As far as the rank and file were concerned, the Emperor simply existed. He had always existed. He looked different sometimes. That was just the Emperor. And critically, even the Dark Council, the 12 most powerful Sith Lords in the Empire beneath him, were not fully briefed on the voice system. They knew the Emperor used intermediaries. They knew they were never truly in the presence of his real self. But the full mechanics of it, the fact that his true body existed separately and was being carefully insulated from all contact, the fact that the being they reported to was a puppet, that level of detail was not shared. The Emperor's hand knew, nobody else did. This is a man who has been running a civilization of paranoid, scheming, backstabbing Sith Lords for centuries, and he did it by making himself literally unknowable. You cannot assassinate something you can never locate. You cannot challenge something you've never actually seen. Every Sith in the Empire who harbored ambitions about someday taking the Emperor's throne was playing against a game board where the most important piece had no fixed position and left no trail. The Sith are supposed to be defined by the pursuit of power and the challenge to authority. The strong overthrow the weak, the apprentice kills the master. The whole system is built on the idea that dominance is always contestable. But how do you contest something you can't find? You don't know what he looks like. You don't know where he is. The body you're talking to right now might be a 60-year-old pureblood, or it might be someone you walked past in the corridor this morning. The Emperor is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And the only thing you can be certain of is that if you move against him, he will know. The result is a culture of Sith who are ferociously ambitious toward each other, but essentially paralyzed when it comes to the top of the hierarchy. One more thing worth noting here: after Revan's attempted assassination, which we'll get into in a later part, Vitiate made the decision to retreat even further from direct engagement. Up until that point, he'd still been using his original body occasionally. After that attempt on his life, the original body essentially went into permanent seclusion on Dromund Kaas, locked away behind Imperial Guard, layers of security, and the simple fact that nobody outside of the Hand even knew for certain it still existed. The body that Vitiate was born with, the Sith pureblood with the pitch-black eyes that witnesses described as the Void itself, after the Revan encounter, that body essentially ceased to be a political actor entirely. It just existed somewhere in the dark, a biological anchor for a consciousness that was busy operating through multiple other people simultaneously, planning things on a scale the galaxy had never seen. Around 4,980 BBY, he disappears into space, heading toward the unknown regions. And as far as the Republic and the Jedi are concerned, that's the end of the story. For 20 years, that fleet drifts. These are military vessels, carrying the traumatized remnants of a collapsed civilization, running on rationed supplies, with no confirmed destination, following a leader whose face most of them have never seen, and whose full plan nobody knows. 20 years of that, children are born on those ships who have never seen a planet. People age, people die, whole generations pass knowing nothing except that they are following the Emperor somewhere, and that somewhere is worth all of this. By the time those ships reach their destination, around 4,960 BBY, the people on them had been shaped by the experience of complete reliance on his leadership into something that was devotional. He was not their emperor in the political sense anymore. He was their reason for existing. They find Dromund Kaas. Now Dromund Kaas is a world with history. It was actually an ancient Sith colony from the original Empire, but its coordinates had been lost to galactic records for centuries, which is exactly why Vitiate chose it. The Republic couldn't find it because they didn't know it existed. The Jedi had no record of it. It was effectively invisible. A jungle world perpetually shrouded in violent electrical storms, heavy with dark side energy, with an atmosphere that crackles with force-saturated lightning constantly. If you were designing a planet specifically to be both hidden and symbolically appropriate for rebuilding a Sith Empire, you couldn't do much better than Dromund Kaas. During the rebuilding period, starting around 4,960 and continuing for decades, he performed dark side rituals so powerful and so sustained that they literally wrecked the ionosphere of the planet. The electromagnetic storms that define Dromund Kaas are a 1,000-year-old side effect of his experiments. The entire climate of the capital world of the Sith Empire was permanently altered by one man's research. Every Imperial citizen who ever looked up at those perpetual storm clouds was looking at physical evidence of what the Emperor is. The planet itself bears his mark, the way a scar bears the mark of a wound. The rebuilding process takes the better part of the first century on Dromund Kaas. From nothing, they construct Kaas City, which becomes the capital of the new empire. The citadel goes up in the center of it, the seat of imperial power, the meeting place of the Dark Council. A Sith Academy gets re-established on reclaimed Korriban for training new force-sensitive recruits. Military academies, shipyards, weapons programs, all of it built from scratch in complete secrecy over decades. And this is the part that boggles my mind when I try to comprehend the scale of it. From roughly 4,960 all the way to 3,681 BBY, Vitiate spent building this empire in the dark, over 1,000 years of patient, methodical, invisible construction. The Republic went about its business, democratic debates, Jedi councils, trade disputes, all the normal business of a functioning civilization, while 20 or 30 or 50 generations of Sith were growing up on Dromund Kaas, learning one thing above all else: the Republic is the enemy. The day of reckoning is coming. We are not dead, we are waiting. Vitiate formally establishes the Dark Council. 12 Sith Lords, the most powerful and useful he had with him during the Exodus, are given seats and assigned spheres of influence. Each controls a pyramid of the imperial hierarchy beneath them. Military strategy, Sith philosophy, ancient knowledge, intelligence, laws and justice, technology, all the machinery of running a civilization, parceled out to 12 people who report ultimately to one. The 12 spheres meant in practice that the entire empire, every institution, every ministry, every military branch ultimately funneled authority upward through one of those 12 seats. And every one of those 12 seats funneled upward to the emperor. It sounds like a standard imperial hierarchy until you consider that Vitiate designed it specifically with the understanding that he intended to be mostly absent. He knew from the start that his focus was going to be elsewhere, on the ritual, planning, on the long game, on things that had nothing to do with day-to-day governance. The Dark Council was a substitute emperor, plural by design, 12 people who could argue with each other endlessly about the day-to-day running of the empire, while the actual emperor was off doing something completely different and nobody could bother him about it. And the Dark Council absolutely did argue, constantly, ferociously, because putting 12 ambitious Sith Lords in a room together and asking them to cooperate is roughly equivalent to putting 12 cats in a bag and asking them to form a committee. The scheming, alliances, betrayals, power plays, all of it was perpetual and exhausting, and from Vitiate's perspective, completely intentional. A Dark Council that's busy fighting each other has no bandwidth to look upward. Keep the most powerful people beneath you, permanently distracted with each other, and you never have to worry about them organizing against you. The new generations of Sith trained on Korriban were not raised the way Sith historically trained. The old Sith Empire under Marka Ragnos had significant ideological diversity, different schools of thought, competing philosophies, lords who built genuine power bases independent of the central hierarchy. Vitiate couldn't have that, so the new Sith were trained with the Emperor as the unchallenged apex of everything. The Emperor wasn't framed as the most powerful Sith. He was framed as a being beyond the Sith, above the code, above the tradition. The tradition existed to serve him, not the other way around. By the time the Empire was ready to reveal itself to the galaxy, 13 centuries after disappearing into the unknown regions, there had not been a single generation of Sith on Drummond Kaas that was raised with any concept of the Emperor as anything other than an eternal, all-powerful, unknowable constant. He had been the Emperor their entire lives. He had been the Emperor their parents' entire lives, and their grandparents. The whole thing was just the natural order of reality. So we're now around 3978 BBY. The Sith Empire has been rebuilding in complete secrecy, and during all of this, Vitiate is operating through his voice system that we talked about earlier. His original body, the Sith pureblood, the one born on Medrias, is sealed away somewhere in the depths of the Citadel on Drummond Kaas, heavily guarded, almost never accessed. Day to day, he exists as a presence filtering through whatever host body he's currently occupying. To the people of the Empire, he is their eternal, unknowable Emperor. To the galaxy outside Drummond Kaas, he simply doesn't exist. Then Revan shows, and everything gets complicated. We are in the opening years of the Mandalorian Wars. On the surface, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders suddenly launching a massive military campaign against the Republic looked like classic Mandalorian aggression. They were warriors. They lived for conquest. It made sense. Except it wasn't spontaneous. Mandalore, the ultimate, the fearsome leader of the entire Mandalorian culture, had been visited by a red-skinned Sith emissary who arrived with two things: a request to help locate a Sith tomb on the frozen world of Rekiad, and a vision. A glorious future in which the Mandalorians crushed the Republic in a battle remembered forever. The vision was bait. What Vitiate actually wanted was intelligence, a stress test of the Republic's military, paid for entirely in Mandalorian lives. How fast did the Jedi respond? Where were the weak points? What did Republic command structure look like when genuinely stretched? The Mandalorian Wars were essentially a free reconnaissance mission on his future target, and Mandalore, the ultimate, was the instrument he used to run it. It's cold in a way that is almost hard to process, an entire civilization sent to die as a data collection exercise. The Mandalorians nearly won, by the way. They had the Republic on the back foot for years until a young Jedi Knight named Revan took command of Republic forces and systematically dismantled them. Brilliant tactician, extraordinary force user, the kind of mind that appears maybe once a generation. Under his leadership, the Republic ground the Mandalorian advance back, culminating in the Battle of Malachor in 3960 BBY, where Revan challenged Mandalore the Ultimate to single combat aboard his flagship and killed him. And as Mandalore lay dying at Revan's feet, coughing up blood, he removed his mask and told the truth. He had been manipulated by a red-skinned Sith, convinced to help uncover a tomb on Rekiad, influenced into launching the entire war. With his last breath, Mandalore handed Revan the coordinates to Rekiad and the thread to pull. Revan pulled it. He and Malak went to Rekiad, found the tomb of Dramath II, Vitiate's half-brother. Then they went to Nathema, and Nathema stopped them cold. Even Revan, who had seen things that would break most people, was shaken by what the dead world did to Force perception. A planet that was a literal void, radiating wrongness at every level of consciousness. Whatever did this was still out there, and it had been building towards something for over 1,000 years. They followed the trail to Dromund Kaas. They spent months undercover on Dromund Kaas, posing as mercenaries, gathering intelligence, trying to understand what they were dealing with. Until eventually Vitiate stopped waiting for them to make a move and had them brought directly to his throne room. The confrontation was over before it started. Vitiate reached into both of their minds simultaneously and dominated them completely. Two of the most powerful Force users of their generation, both at the peak of their abilities, crushed mentally in an eye blink. He bent them to his will, sent them back to the Republic as advance agents, a vanguard to weaken it from within before his eventual full invasion. The plan was clean, but Revan's will was not a normal will. Over time, improbably, both he and Malak broke free of the conditioning. Instead of weakening the Republic for Vitiate, they established their own Sith Empire. The Jedi Civil War erupted. Malak eventually betrayed Revan. The whole thing spiraled away from what Vitiate intended. And a redeemed Revan, memory wiped, rebuilt by the Jedi, spent years quietly piecing together who he used to be and what he'd seen in the unknown regions. By 3954 BBY, Revan knows enough. He knows the Empire exists. He knows it's enormous, patient, and has been building for over 1,000 years. He knows it's coming. So he leaves his wife, Bastila Shan, on Coruscant, pregnant with their child, tells her nothing specific, and goes back alone to do something about it. He gets shot down over Dromund Kaas immediately upon arrival and is captured by Darth Nihis, a Dark Council member, secretly part of a conspiracy against Vitiate. He spends the next 4 years as her prisoner, being studied and tortured, while the conspiracy plays out around him. Then Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile, his oldest friend, tracks him down. Together with a Sith named Lord Scourge, who has his own reasons for wanting the Emperor dead, they form a plan. Get to the throne room, kill him, end it before the war starts. They actually get there. They fight their way in and confront Vitiate directly, a being who has been alive for over 1,000 years, operating through a voice body with a connection to the dark side so vast that every other Force user in the galaxy barely registers by comparison. Even filtered through a host, his power is simply on a different level from anything Revan has faced. During the battle, Scourge receives a Force vision, a future Jedi, someone who doesn't yet exist, who will be the one to actually defeat the Emperor. And Revan is not in that vision. So Scourge makes a cold calculation in real time. He betrays them. Revan, suddenly alone against the Emperor without his ally, is overwhelmed, nearly electrocuted to death. Only stopped when his astromech droid sets Vitiate on fire with a flamethrower, of all things, buying enough time for a stalemate. But ultimately Revan is captured. Vitiate could kill him. The logical move is execution. This man broke his conditioning twice, found Dromund Kaas twice, and got further than anyone before him. You eliminate that, you don't keep it around. But Vitiate doesn't kill him, because Revan's mind fascinates him. Specifically the fact that his will resisted total domination not once but twice. That level of mental resilience is something Vitiate has never encountered in over 1,000 years. So Revan goes into stasis in the Maelstrom prison, conscious but physically frozen. Locked in a mental link with the Emperor, his thoughts accessible, his memories readable. Except locking Revan in your head cuts both ways. While Vitiate feeds on his mind, studies his resistance, Revan quietly pushes back. He can't escape physically, but the connection runs in both directions. And every time Vitiate's planning edges toward the moment of launching the invasion, Revan introduces friction. Historians who have gone through the Star Wars The Old Republic timeline carefully note that the Great Galactic War was supposed to begin significantly earlier than 3681 BBY. The roughly 3-century gap between Revan's capture and the actual start of the war maps almost precisely onto his influence from inside the prison. He couldn't stop the war, but he delayed it by 300 years from inside a stasis pod, with no body and no allies, using nothing but the strength of his mind pressing against the mind of a god. 300 years Revan sat in that box, conscious, isolated, with nothing but his own will, and held back the largest, most prepared military force in galactic history for that entire stretch of time, buying the Republic centuries it didn't know it needed, fought by a man it had long since forgotten. 3681 BBY, that's the year. Mark it down. A diplomatic convoy in the Tingle Arm. A completely routine mission. The kind of thing that happens 100 times a year. Made contact with unidentified warships emerging from the unknown regions. The convoy beamed their reports back to Republic space. Strange vessels, unknown design, and then the warships opened fire and destroyed the convoy completely. That was the opening shot of the Great Galactic War. Now let's talk about the scale of what Vitiate had actually built, because the Republic's response in those early weeks was essentially shock paralysis. And that paralysis makes complete sense once you understand what they were looking at. The Sith fleet that emerged from the unknown regions was the product of over 2.5 centuries of dedicated, accelerating military build-up. Wikipedia describes the final preparations for invasion taking roughly 250 years of increasingly intense production. Shipyards running continuously, weapons programs in full acceleration, war games conducted daily in the years immediately preceding the attack. The Imperial Navy that hit the Republic was a machine that had been building toward this single moment for longer than most civilizations exist. But the fleet wasn't the only thing Vitiate had prepared. For generations before a single shot was fired, Imperial agents had been operating inside Republic space. Sleeper operatives embedded in political circles, military structures, trade organizations. The Ovair family is the documented example. 3 generations of a single family serving the Sith Emperor from within the Jedi Order itself, with Baral Ovair eventually becoming a Jedi Master, all while feeding intelligence back to Drummond Cass. 3 generations. One family passing the mission down like your inheritance. That's the depth of the preparation we're talking about. Beyond the spies, Vitiate had secured alliances. The Chiss Ascendancy, the sophisticated, militarily advanced species from the unknown regions, who would later produce Grand Admiral Thrawn, had been quietly brought into an arrangement with the Empire before the war started. Puppet governments had been installed in key Outer Rim systems. Before a single Republic soldier knew there was a war on, the Empire already controlled the Belkadan, Ruria, and Cern Pedal systems in the Delombian sector. Real estate acquired in complete silence, waiting to serve as staging grounds for the early push into Republic territory. The Galactic Senate's response to all of this was, predictably, deadlock. Committees formed, debates happened, representatives argued about jurisdiction and resource allocation, while Sith fleets systematically dismantled the Outer Rim. The Sluis Van shipyards, one of the Republic's most critical naval production facilities, were destroyed early in the campaign, a surgical strike that immediately hampered the Republic's ability to replace the ships it was losing. The Rimmer trade route was blockaded, the Aparo sector fell and immediately defected to the Empire. World after world went dark while the Senate discussed procedural matters. Individual Jedi Masters and Republic military commanders who didn't wait for the Senate saved what could be saved in those early years. Master Nos Dural's historical records, compiled after the war ended, specifically note that without those individuals taking independent action, the Republic might have collapsed entirely in the first decade. That's how close it was. The most powerful democratic republic in galactic history, with millennia of accumulated strength and resources, was nearly folded in 10 years by a force it never saw coming. And Vitiate at this point is watching all of it from Drummond Cass, his original body sealed. What he's feeling, if he still feels anything resembling human emotion, is probably not excitement, More likely something closer to satisfaction, that the machinery is finally running the way it was designed to run. He did not care about winning in the traditional sense. Conquest, territory, political dominance, those are the goals of someone who wants an empire. Vitiate already had an empire. What he actually wanted was something the war could facilitate, but not deliver by itself. He needed the galaxy weakened. He needed the Jedi depleted. He needed the Republic broken down enough that when the time came to attempt the galactic ritual, the Nathema event, but on an incomprehensible scale, there would be no organized resistance capable of stopping it. The war was a means, always a means. What also gets overlooked is that the war didn't go entirely according to plan. The Battle of Bothawi in 3671 BBY, 10 years into the conflict, was the first major Imperial defeat, and it was significant enough that Vitiate himself was forced to re-examine his strategy. A Republic commander pulled off an ambush using asteroid-mounted turrets that annihilated the Sith assault force. The Empire halted its push into the mid-rim. Vitiate pivoted, spent years rebuilding the alliance with Mandalorian clans, which eventually resulted in the Mandalorian blockade of the Hydian Way in 3660 BBY, strangling the Republic's most critical supply route and reversing the momentum again. He adapts. He finds another angle. When the direct approach gets blunted, he builds an indirect one. When one tool breaks, he reaches for a different tool. A millennium of patience doesn't produce a temper. It produces a man who simply recalculates and keeps moving. The war grinds on. 28 years total, 3681 to 3653 BBY, the longest sustained galactic conflict in recorded history at that point. Thousands of Jedi killed, countless worlds ravaged, the Republic economy shattered, its infrastructure in ruins, its Senate fractured and demoralized. By the time the Dark Council approached the Republic Senate with an offer of peace talks, the Republic didn't accept out of confidence. They accepted because they literally couldn't afford to say no. And even the peace talks, all of it orchestrated by Vitiate toward a specific outcome. Which brings us directly to what happens next. The moment that defines the entire war, reduces the Republic to its knees in a single afternoon, and cements Vitiate's strategic reputation as something beyond conventional military genius. 3653 BBY, after nearly 3 decades of grinding, relentless military pressure, after systematically dismantling the Outer Rim, after the Mandalorian blockade of the Hydian Way that nearly starved the Republic's war machine entirely, the Dark Council suddenly sends a message to the Galactic Senate. We want to talk peace. Come to Alderaan. Let's negotiate a treaty. The Senate is suspicious. Of course they are. You don't fight someone for 28 years and then suddenly believe them when they say they want to be friends. The Jedi High Council specifically urges caution. Master Nosdural and others smell something wrong immediately. But the Republic Senate looks at the state of their own civilization. The shattered economy, the depleted military, the world still smoking from Imperial bombardment. The Supreme Chancellor, who is terrified of being assassinated and has started running deliberately low-profile re-election campaigns because the Empire kills candidates, and they make the calculation that they simply cannot afford to say no. Peace, even suspicious peace, is better than continued war when you're losing. So the delegations travel to Alderaan. Republic diplomats, Jedi representatives, Imperial counterparts. Everyone sits down at the table on one of the galaxy's most peaceful, scenic worlds to discuss the future. Meanwhile, in complete silence, a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Shae Vizsla lands on Coruscant. Nobody notices her, and that's the point. Shae Vizsla had one job: find the control center for Coruscant's planetary defense grid and shut it down. The defense grid that protected the capital of the entire Republic. The shield that would detect any incoming fleet and give the planetary garrison time to respond. Turned off by a single person, while everyone else was looking at Alderaan. The plans for this operation had been in motion since around 3660 BBY. 7 years of preparation for what ultimately took 2 days to execute. The strike force had been assembled, trained, briefed, and positioned long before the peace offer was ever sent. The peace offer wasn't the beginning of a negotiation. It was the starting pistol for an operation that was already fully loaded and ready to fire. The moment the defense grid went dark, Darth Malgus moved. If you don't know Malgus, he's one of the more fascinating figures in this whole era, a Sith Lord who believed in what he was doing in a way that most Imperials didn't. Fanatical, physically enormous, wearing a respirator after a Jedi shattered his jaw in an earlier battle. Absolutely terrifying in combat. He led 50 Sith warriors in a stolen Republic transport that crashed directly into the front of the Jedi Temple. Master Ven Zalo was the Jedi who responded. He was good, one of the more capable Temple defenders of his generation. He and a group of Jedi Knights engaged Malgus and his warriors in the Temple's main hall, fighting desperately among the ancient architecture while the buildings shook around them. Zalo was killed by Malgus personally in that fight. The other defenders fell one by one. The Temple, which had stood as the heart of the Jedi Order for millennia, was overrun in a matter of hours. While that was happening above ground, Darth Angral's fleet dropped out of hyperspace over Coruscant, a full Imperial armada, descending on a planet whose defense grid was offline and whose garrison had no warning. Turbolasers opened up on the cityscape, not targeting military installations specifically, targeting the city. Coruscant is an ecumenopolis, a planet that is one continuous city from pole to pole, and the bombardment tore through densely populated residential and commercial areas. The fires that broke out in the lower levels burned for days afterward because there was no coordinated response left to fight them. 6 Jedi Council members were killed. The death toll across 2 days of occupation landed somewhere between tens of thousands and 100,000 people. Imperial forces captured the Senate Tower while Malgus was still clearing the temple. The entire planet, the beating heart of the Republic, was held hostage. The Supreme Chancellor, sitting on Alderaan, watching the feeds coming in from Coruscant, was handed a document. The Treaty of Coruscant, already written, already fully detailed, dictated entirely by the Empire. Sign it. End the war, right now. He signed it. Coruscant was in Imperial hands. Angral had the fleet in orbit. The Republic's leadership was physically present on Alderaan, in Imperial custody essentially. If the goal was total conquest, this was the moment. The treaty he dictated was punishing but not terminal. The Republic ceded several strategic systems. They were forced to abandon ongoing military campaigns across multiple fronts, leaving their own allies completely exposed. Thousands of soldiers fighting for the Republic on distant worlds suddenly received orders to stand down and withdraw, leaving populations they'd been defending to whatever fate the Empire decided. The economic terms were crippling. The psychological impact, your capital burned, your Jedi Temple destroyed, your Chancellor forced to sign at gunpoint, was enormous and deliberately calculated to linger. But the Republic survived, and that was intentional. Vitiate needed the Republic to survive in a weakened, humiliated, destabilized state. A dead Republic is a problem solved. It stops being useful. A wounded Republic nursing its burns, rebuilding slowly, spending the next decade in internal political crisis over who to blame for the sacking while the Empire consolidates its gains, that Republic is still a functioning target for the galactic ritual he's been planning. You can't consume a galaxy of dead worlds. You need living things to drain. The Republic staying alive, full of billions of terrified, demoralized people, was precisely the outcome Vitiate wanted. Even Darth Malgus understood this at some level, and it infuriated him. Malgus believed the treaty was a mistake, that the Empire should have pressed the advantage and finished the job. He saw the peace offer as weakness, a betrayal of the Sith's true purpose. He was wrong, but not in the way he thought. It wasn't weakness, it was a different objective entirely, one that Malgus wasn't senior enough or trusted enough to be told about. The galaxy, after the sacking of Coruscant, looked, on the surface, like a world settling into an uneasy peace. Republic rebuilding, Empire consolidating, both sides exhausted, both sides preparing for the next inevitable round. The Cold War beginning. Normal enough in the language of geopolitics. Underneath that surface, Vitiate was already moving toward the next phase. The war had served its purpose. The Republic was cracked and demoralized. The Jedi were scattered and shaken, relocated to their ancient homeworld of Tython after being blamed in part for failing to protect Coruscant. The political structures that might organize resistance to what was coming were fractured and consumed with internal argument. The board was set exactly the way he needed it. And nobody, not the Senate, not the Jedi Council, not the Dark Council, knew what he was actually preparing to do next. On the surface, what follows is a Cold War, that uncomfortable stretch of armed peace where both sides are rebuilding, rearming, and watching each other with barely concealed hostility. Republic and Empire carving up the galaxy between them. Proxy conflicts breaking out on border worlds. Intelligence agencies running operations against each other in the shadows. It looks from the outside like two superpowers caught in a familiar standoff. Tense, fragile, but functional. Except there's one massive detail that nobody on either side fully grasps. The Emperor doesn't actually care about the Cold War at all. The Republic, the Empire, Dark Council's endless scheming, the border skirmishes, political maneuvering, from where Vitiate is sitting, all of that is background noise. He's been operating through his voice bodies, staying almost completely out of Imperial governance, letting the Dark Council run the day-to-day while he's focused on something else entirely. The Emperor is absent. He's mentally absent. When the Council tries to reach him through official channels, through the voice, through the Emperor's hand, responses are slow or strange, or don't come at all. Darth Ma, one of the more perceptive Council members, reportedly observed that throughout the entire Cold War period, the Emperor seemed distracted in a way that had no precedent in anyone's memory. As if his attention was simply elsewhere, as if the Empire itself had become a secondary concern. He was right, the Empire was a secondary concern. It always had been, actually. The lore confirms that Vitiate explicitly considered the Sith Empire his side project. The real focus, the thing consuming his attention during the Cold War and for centuries before it, was something else. Something nobody in the Empire knew about. For now, let's talk about what Vitiate was doing during the Cold War. About 25 years before the Treaty of Coruscant, Vitiate had begun creating something called the Children of the Emperor. And this program is one of the most disturbing things he ever did, which is saying something given the competition. Agents of the Emperor's hand, his 12 most trusted servants, would travel throughout the galaxy and identify Force-sensitive infants. Newborns, babies. They would take these children from their families, bring them to Korriban, and present them before the Emperor himself. And Vitiate would then perform a ritual, infusing a fragment of his own power and consciousness into each child, creating a mental link that would persist for the rest of that child's life. And then the child would be returned or placed into a normal life somewhere in the galaxy, growing up completely unaware of what had been done to them. These children grew into adults. They became senators, soldiers, civilians, Jedi, living normal lives, building careers, forming relationships, having no idea that somewhere in the back of their mind there was a door. And on the other side of that door was Vitiate, capable at any moment of opening that door and stepping through, activating the link, overriding the person's will, turning them into a puppet with no warning and no resistance. The children didn't know they were children. Most of them went their entire lives without ever being activated. They were sleeper agents, in the most literal possible sense. The confirmed number of children active during the Cold War period is described as having infiltrated every level of Republic society. The Senate, military, the Jedi Order itself, the most protected, most Force-sensitive organization in the galaxy, dedicated specifically to detecting and resisting dark side influence, and Vitiate had his hooks in members of it. The case of Siobha Khan is the documented example. A sitting Jedi Council member, respected and trusted, secretly harboring a second personality embedded by the Emperor that the lore calls the First Son. Bakan's own mind was a puppet theatre, and he had no idea. He went to council meetings, made decisions about the direction of the Jedi Order, and had absolutely no conscious knowledge that part of his identity existed solely to protect the other children from being detected. The paranoia that creates when you pull back and look at the full picture is almost vertiginous. Anyone could be a child, your colleague, your commander, your master. The link is deeply embedded, shielded by the First Son's presence from Force detection. What were the children actually for? What was Vitiate building this network toward? The Nathema ritual, draining all life from an entire planet to achieve immortality. That was the proof of concept, what Vitiate had been building towards since Nathema, what he had spent 1,000 years of research and preparation working toward, was the same ritual performed on a galactic scale. Every living thing in the galaxy, every human, every alien, every animal, every plant, every microorganism touched by the Force, drained simultaneously, all of it flowing into him. The deaths of hundreds of billions of sentient beings and countless trillions of other living things absorbed into a single consciousness, transforming Vitiate into something that had never existed before, a literal singular entity containing within itself the entirety of the Force energy that had previously sustained all life in the galaxy. Even by Sith standards, this is insane. The Sith want power, they want dominance, they want to rule. He wanted to be alone. The endgame of his entire existence, all 1,500 years of it, was a galaxy of dead worlds with one consciousness floating through them. It's not evil in any recognizable political sense. It's something closer to a force of nature, deciding it prefers a vacuum. The children were part of the mechanism. The war was part of the mechanism. Around 3,641 BBY, during the renewed conflict that followed the Cold War's collapse, Vitiate's agents made their move. They began the ritual, the preliminary stages, the processes that needed to be completed across multiple worlds before the main event could be triggered. The Jedi Knight the lore calls the hero of Tython managed to interrupt the process and fight through to Vitiate's voice directly, defeating it in combat on Dromund Kaas. That confrontation nearly killed the Emperor. Actually him, the consciousness behind it. Vitiate's spirit was damaged severely enough that he went into a kind of hibernation on Yavin 4, his presence diminished almost to nothing, requiring time to recover. He surfaced briefly, reached out to a planet called SWTOR, and possessed its entire civilian population simultaneously. Every single person on the planet inhabited, populated billions of lives, overridden at once. Citizens attacking each other at his direction. Imperial forces caught completely off guard on their own world. And then, when he had generated sufficient dark side energy from the carnage, he drained SWTOR entirely. Every living thing on the planet consumed in hours. A dead world, a wound in the Force, lifeless and wrong forever. He did that while critically weakened, while recovering, as a pit stop. When the Dark Council saw what happened on SWTOR, drained by their own Emperor as a snack, the political calculation inside the Empire shifted completely. The threat was no longer the Republic. The threat was sitting on the throne on Dromund Kaas. And for the first time in the history of the reconstituted Sith Empire, the Dark Council started looking for ways to stop him rather than serve him. They were about 1,000 years too late, but at least they finally understood what they'd been working for all along. Now this is the most interesting part. The thing that even his own Dark Council didn't know. The thing that, when it finally comes to light, reframes everything we thought we understood about his goals and his methods. While all of that was happening, the Great Galactic War, sacking of Coruscant, the Cold War, children of the Emperor, the SWTOR massacre, Vitiate was living a completely separate life somewhere else entirely. A different planet, a different name, a different face, a different civilization that nobody in the Republic or the Sith Empire knew existed. His name there was Valkorion, and he had been building something that made the Sith Empire look like a warm-up act. Let's go back to before the Great Galactic War, somewhere in the centuries of preparation on Dromund Kaas. At some point during that long stretch of secret rebuilding, Vitiate sent his consciousness out into wild space, the largely unexplored region beyond the Outer Rim, and found a planet called Zakuul. And on Zakuul he found something that interested him for the first time in a very long while. A human warrior, exceptionally capable, living among a population with a rich cultural mythology and a deep, if untrained, connection to the Force. He took the man's body, suppressed the original consciousness completely, and became Valkorion. As Valkorion on Zakuul, Vitiate didn't present himself as a dark god or a conqueror or an eternal predator. He presented himself as a philosopher king, a wise, beloved ruler who genuinely appeared to care about his people and their civilization. He built Zakuul into something extraordinary, a technologically advanced society that surpassed both the Republic and the Sith Empire in several key areas. centered around a philosophy that didn't align strictly with light or dark side, but drew from both. The Knights of Zakuul, his warrior order, were Force users trained in a completely different tradition from either Jedi or Sith. More balanced, more pragmatic. In some ways more dangerous precisely because they weren't constrained by either orthodoxy. He also built the Eternal Fleet, and the Eternal Fleet is worth spending a moment on because it's genuinely one of the most remarkable military assets in this entire era of Star Wars lore. Automated warships run by model artificial intelligence droids, capable of hyperspace travel, and produced in numbers that dwarfed anything the Republic or Sith Empire could field. The Eternal Fleet was essentially inexhaustible from a production standpoint, manufactured in facilities so advanced that losses could be replaced faster than enemies could inflict them. Neither the Republic nor the Sith Empire, even at their respective peaks, had anything that could compete with it technologically. Vitiate had spent centuries building the Sith Empire's military as a blunt instrument. The Eternal Fleet was a surgical one, precise, overwhelming, and operating on a completely different level. And the question you're probably already asking, why? Why build a second empire? Why go through the trouble of creating an entirely separate civilization under a completely different identity when you already have the most powerful Sith Empire in history sitting on Dromund Kaas? The Sith Empire was always a tool. He built it to weaken the Republic, to deplete the Jedi, to create the conditions for his galactic ritual. But tools are expendable. And Vitiate, who had already watched one Sith Empire collapse in the Great Hyperspace War, was not the kind of entity who puts all his resources in one place. Zakuul was his backup, his insurance policy, his alternative when the Sith Empire eventually became more trouble than it was worth, which, after Ziost, it very much had. Now, while all of this was happening on Zakuul, this centuries-long project of civilization building under the Valkorion identity, Vitiate also had a family. His bodyguard and consort was a knight of Zakuul named Senya Tirol, a woman who, by all accounts, was fiercely capable, deeply principled, and one of the few people in his entire existence who interacted with him as a person rather than as a force of nature. They had 3 children, twin boys Arkan and Thexan, and a daughter named Vaylin. Senya was a devoted mother. The children played together in the swamps outside the capital. Arkan and Thexan sparred constantly, trained together, were inseparable in the way that only twins can be. Vaylin was younger, and already even as a toddler, displaying force abilities of extraordinary intensity. She was moving furniture while still in the womb. As a child, she tore apart droids. Once, she crippled a palace guard who accidentally dropped a ball she had tossed to him. That last detail got Valkorion's attention, and his response to it tells you everything about whether fatherhood actually changed anything fundamental in him. He was afraid of her. Not in any way he would acknowledge as fear. Vitiate doesn't do fear, or at least doesn't recognize it in himself. But his daughter's raw power was something he couldn't fully predict or control. She was potentially stronger than him in pure force potential. And for a being whose entire existence has been built around absolute control, a daughter who might one day exceed his power was not something he could tolerate. His solution was to have her taken to Nathema, the dead world, the void in the Force, the planet he personally killed, and locked in a facility called the Sanitarium, where she was subjected to intense mental conditioning designed to sever her from most of her power and install psychological triggers that would limit her even when she tried to access it. He sent his own child to the place he destroyed an entire civilization to be tortured into a controllable version of herself. And then he brought her back when it was done, handed her a lightsaber, and acted as if nothing had happened. Senya found out what had been done to Vaylin and tried desperately to get her children away from Valkorion. They rejected her. By that point, they had been raised to see their father as the immovable center of reality, and their mother as someone who simply didn't understand the way things worked. A broken-hearted Senya returned to service in the outer fringes of the Empire, never to speak with Valkorion again. Arkan, meanwhile, was growing into something complicated. He was powerful, trained from childhood to be a warrior, deeply loyal to his twin, Thexan, and increasingly quietly furious at his father's indifference. Valkorion acknowledged his sons in the way a chess player acknowledges his pieces. They existed in relation to his plans. Their achievements registered as useful or irrelevant. Their emotional needs simply didn't appear on his radar. By 3636 BBY, the twins were adults, and they asked permission to lead raids into the core worlds, a demonstration of the Eternal Empire's strength against both the Republic and the Sith. Valkorion approved the raids, but ordered only Thexan to lead them. Arcan was to stay behind. Arcan disobeyed, went anyway, and during the fighting lost his left arm and suffered severe burns to half his face. He came back to his father's throne room, bleeding and scarred, expecting, needing some acknowledgement, some recognition. Instead, Valkorion turned his attention immediately to someone else who had just arrived in the throne room, an outsider, a stranger, someone more interesting. That dismissal was the match that lit everything. Thexan tried to restrain his brother. Arcan, lost in rage and dark side energy, engaged in a furious lightsaber duel with Thexan, and in a moment of horror he will never recover from, killed him. His own twin, his closest person in the world, dead at his feet by his own hand, and Valkorion simply approached his surviving son and told him to come along. No reaction to Thexan's death at all. Shortly after, Darth Maul led a joint Republic Imperial task force into wild space investigating leads about the mysterious power source behind recent disturbances. They found the Eternal Empire instead. Valkorion sent the Eternal Fleet. The task force was annihilated in minutes. Mar and one other survivor, the figure the lore calls the Outlander, were captured and brought before the Eternal Throne. Mar recognized Valkorion immediately and named him for what he was, Vitiate, the Sith Emperor. Valkorion killed Mar on the spot with a single blast of Force lightning, and then turned his full attention to the Outlander, who was different, who had something in them that Vitiate found genuinely interesting for the first time in a very long time. Arcan moved. Using his father's momentary distraction, he attacked. The blow landed. Valkorion's physical body, the Valkorion body he had occupied for centuries, sustained far beyond its natural lifespan by his power, took a mortal wound, and as the body fell, the consciousness inside it refused to die. Vitiate's spirit detached from the dying body and moved into the Outlander, the one mind in the room he hadn't already accounted for. A new host, a new body, a new game. Arcan sensed it instantly and had the Outlander frozen in carbonite before they could act, but he also knew, everyone in that room knew, that the carbonite was a delay, not a solution. You cannot kill something that just moves when its body dies. The Eternal Empire then did what the Eternal Fleet was built for. Within a year of Valkorion's death, the combined might of the Eternal Fleet had brought both the Republic and the Sith Empire to their knees. Two of the most powerful civilizations in galactic history, each of which had been fighting each other to a standstill for decades, both forced into submission within 12 months by the fleet Vitiate built as his backup plan. The tribute came pouring in. Zakuul became the dominant power in the known galaxy, and Vitiate himself, frozen in carbonite, in the mind of the one person who might eventually be able to stop him, whispering from inside their consciousness, was already planning his next move. Arcan sitting on the Eternal Throne, wearing his father's crown, pointing the most powerful military force in galactic history at anything that moved without permission. And Vitiate himself, frozen in carbonite, somewhere in a vault inside the spire. The great tower at the heart of Zakuul's capital is already working. The carbonite isn't a prison for him, the way it's a prison for the body inside it. Vitiate's consciousness is active, aware. The transfer into the Outlander's mind happened the moment Valkorion's body took Arcan's blow, and no amount of carbonite changes what's already inside someone's head. He is in there, in the dark, in the frozen silence, talking, showing visions, making his case. He tells them years have passed. He shows them what the galaxy looks like now, under Arcan's rule. He explains, calmly and without apology, that they have a shared problem and a shared solution. He needs the Outlander's body. The Outlander needs his knowledge. The Eternal Throne needs someone capable of actually running what he built. The Outlander, for their part, notices that Vaylin is staring directly at them during one of these visions, which is the first indication that Vitiate's presence inside their mind isn't as invisible to Force sensitives as he perhaps intended. 5 years pass like this. The galaxy outside groans under tribute demands, and eternal fleet bombardments. Arcan rules with the kind of instability you'd expect from someone who killed his twin brother, seized power by framing a stranger for his father's murder, and has the constant psychic awareness that his father is still alive somewhere inside the person he imprisoned. He's not a stable emperor. He's a traumatized son with unlimited military power and no one capable of telling him no. Then, in 3631 BBY, Lana Beniko makes her move. Lana is a former Sith intelligence minister. Sharp, pragmatic, one of the few people in the old Imperial hierarchy who understood early that the Emperor was more dangerous to the galaxy than the Republic ever was. She spent the 5 years of Arcan's reign doing the thing that kept her alive and useful, gathering information, building contacts, operating in the shadows of the New Order without drawing attention. And she finally got the intelligence she needed. The Outlander was alive, frozen in carbonite, stored in Arcan's personal vault inside the spire like a trophy. She put together the smallest possible team because the smallest possible team was the only team that could get inside the spire without triggering every alarm on Zakuul simultaneously. Herself, an astromech droid called T-701, a former Zakuulan naval officer named Koth Vortena, who had defected after Arcan ordered a civilian massacre he refused to participate in, and a bodyguard droid called HK-55. 4 people, 2 of them droids, walking into the most heavily fortified building on the capital world of the most powerful empire in the galaxy to steal the Emperor's most prized possession. They pulled it off. Lana found the Outlander inside the vault, cracked the carbonite, immediately identified that the freezing process had been imperfect and was actively poisoning the thawed body, and administered an antidote before the Outlander had even fully registered where they were. What followed was a running escape through the spire that went sideways almost immediately. The alarm was raised, skytroopers everywhere, and then Vaylin arrived personally, which tells you something about how seriously Arcan took the security of that vault. His sister, the High Justice of the Eternal Empire, one of the most powerful Force users alive, responding in person to an intrusion alarm. They ran. Koth's shuttle got shot up badly enough by Vaylin that when they finally escaped the spire, they crash-landed in the endless swamp surrounding Zakuul's capital rather than getting clean off the planet. Which is where the story takes a turn nobody planned for. Because stumbling through the swamp trying to figure out their next move, HK-55 picked up a sensor reading on something that was not native to Zakuul. They went to investigate and found the gravestone. The gravestone is an ancient alien warship of unknown origin that predates basically everything in the current era of galactic history. It had passed into legend. Most people treated it as mythology, the kind of story that gets told in cantinas and gets less believable every time someone retells it. The story was that the gravestone had once single-handedly stood up to the Eternal Fleet and survived, which, if true, made it the only vessel in the galaxy capable of that. It had been sitting in the Zakuulan swamps, hidden, untouched, waiting. For how long, nobody knew. Koth immediately understood what they had. He convinced the group to repair it rather than find another way off the planet. While they worked, Lana caught the Outlander up on 5 years of galactic history they had missed. The subjugation of the Republic, the collapse of the Sith Empire's resistance, the tribute system, Arcan's increasingly erratic rule. And Vitiate, inside the Outlander's mind, introduced himself properly. He confirmed he was alive. He confirmed he intended to help. He framed it as a partnership, promising his assistance in critical moments in exchange for the Outlander working toward reclaiming the Eternal Throne, which he very carefully did not specify was ultimately meant to be reclaimed for him personally. Senya Tiral found them in the swamp. Arcan and Vaylin's mother, the woman who had once been Valkorion's companion, now a rogue knight who had resigned her position after Arcan ordered the massacre of the Scions of Zakuul, a prophetic order within the Knights whose visions had started predicting very inconvenient things about the Eternal Empire's future. Senya knew the gravestone was there. She'd been protecting it. Her arrival with the group gave them the firepower they needed to hold their ground long enough to get the ship airborne. One blast from the gravestone's omnicannon destroyed more than 24 Eternal Fleet warships before they jumped to hyperspace. Arcan, watching from the surface, understood immediately that something had changed. The Eternal Fleet was no longer automatically invincible. What followed over the next several months was the building of the Alliance. The Outlander, now publicly named as the person who killed Valkorion, whether they actually did or not, became the symbol that resistance movements across the galaxy had been waiting for. Republic remnants, Imperial holdouts, mercenaries, defectors, Force users from traditions outside both the Jedi and Sith, all of them converging on a hidden base on the planet Odessen. A world so deeply saturated with both light and dark side energy simultaneously that it essentially neutralized both, making it nearly impossible to detect through Force perception. The perfect hiding place for an alliance that included both Jedi and Sith among its ranks. And Vitiate was there for all of it, present in the background of every planning session, every battle, every moment the Outlander pushed further toward the confrontation with Arcann that everyone knew was coming. He offered power at critical moments, genuine Force amplification, real tactical intelligence, actual knowledge of Eternal Fleet vulnerabilities that nobody else had. Every piece of help built the account a little higher. Every rescue made the implicit argument a little louder. You need me. This works. Let me in further. The Battle of Odessen was the turning point. Arcann brought the Eternal Fleet to destroy the Alliance base directly. Scorpio, the artificial intelligence who had been serving as an Alliance advisor, betrayed them by revealing Odessen's location. The Gravestone's Omnicannon tore into the fleet while the Outlander, Lana and Senya boarded Arcann's flagship. The Outlander found Arcann on the bridge. They fought, and the Outlander, drawing on 5 years of Vitiate's presence and the power he offered in that final moment, defeated him, crushed him under debris. Arcann survived, but his reign was over. Scorpio then revealed her actual agenda. She wasn't serving Arcann or the Alliance, she was serving herself. Having determined that the Eternal Fleet's droids were her kin, and she intended to lead them, she seized control of the remaining fleet and delivered it to Vaylin, who became the new Eternal Empress. Which meant the war wasn't over. It had just changed hands from a broken, traumatized son to something arguably more dangerous. A woman with no psychological constraints left, unlimited military power, and a list of people she wanted dead that started with her own family and expanded outward from there. Arcann, stripped of the throne, hunted by his own sister, slowly found his way towards something nobody expected: redemption. Senya reached him, the mother he had pushed away, the person who had never stopped trying to get her children back. She finally got through to him. Arcann joined the alliance against Vaylin, and the final campaign began. The Outlander fighting toward the Eternal Throne, with Vitiate riding along, patient as ever, waiting for the moment everything he had been building toward finally arrived. He was almost there, he could taste it. And now the galaxy has a problem that is arguably worse than Arcann ever was. Because Arcann, for all his instability and rage, still had something resembling a leash on him, the psychological weight of his father's presence, the conditioning of growing up under Valkorion's shadow, the residual fear of what Vitiate represented. Vaylin has none of that, she never did. As we said earlier, Vaylin from the very beginning was extraordinary in a way that made everyone around her uncomfortable. Force abilities emerging in a toddler that trained adults couldn't match, uncontrolled, raw, enormous. Vitiate looked at it and saw a threat. The law is explicit. He recognized himself in Vaylin. The same hunger, the same raw potential, and he sent her to Nathema. The sanitarium is the only standing structure on Nathema, a single building on a lifeless grey wasteland, where the sun looks brown through the warped atmosphere, and the silence is so total it becomes a sound of its own. Vitiate had been using it for years as a research facility, sending powerful Force users who opposed him there for experimentation, because the Force void made resistance essentially impossible. You arrive stripped of the one thing that makes you dangerous, and then you stay there until you're useful or you die. He established zealots as wardens, Force-sensitive beings who had been conditioned so thoroughly that their power was focused and their free will was essentially gone, who had become so dependent on the void that they would go catatonic if they left the planet's surface. A failed experiment in building a subservient army, repurposed as prison guards. Typical Vitiate. Nothing is wasted, everything is extracted for maximum utility. And then he recruited Jarek, an animid scientist, an outcast among his own people for the nature of his research, given a single instruction regarding Vaylin: use any method that doesn't kill her. The zealots performed ritualistic procedures on Vaylin, covering her arms in conditioning tattoos, shaving her head, the trauma of which permanently altered her hair pigmentation so that it grew back darker. Jarek eventually exhausted conventional conditioning methods and moved to machines of his own design. One device, eventually referred to in the records as the Brain, was an experimental super weapon. No other test subject had ever survived exposure to it. Jarek's own notes record that he believed if Vaylin's power erupted during the process, it would bring down the entire sanitarium. She was a child through most of this. Senya found out. Mothers always find out. She infiltrated the sanitarium, fought her way past 6 zealots on her own, found Vaylin unconscious, and carried her to the landing platform. When Vaylin opened her eyes and saw her mother, Senya told her to stay back while she handled the remaining guards. She reached for her daughter's hand. Then Vitiate emerged from the sanitarium personally. His Knights of Zakul restrained Senya, and he took Vaylin back inside. The last image Vaylin had of that moment was her mother being dragged away, which the conditioning, already deep enough to distort her perception of events, would later reframe not as Senya being forcibly removed, but as Senya abandoning her, leaving her there, choosing not to fight hard enough. That reframing was engineered. Senya represented the one relationship that could have given Vaylin something to hold on to, a genuine emotional anchor, someone who loved her without agenda. Destroying that relationship from the inside was as much a part of the conditioning as anything Jarek did with his machines. Vaylin spent years on Nathema. Her only visitor during that time was her brother Thexan, who brought her gifts from worlds the Eternal Empire had conquered. Small comforts dropped off by the one person in her family who apparently still thought of her as a person rather than a problem to be managed. Those visits from Thexan are, when you pull back and look at the full picture, some of the saddest details in her entire story. When the conditioning was finally complete, Vitiate brought her back to Zakul, handed her a lightsaber with a yellow blade, gave her the title of High Justice, pointed her at his enemies and said, "Go." She was his weapon now, filed down into exactly the shape he needed, with a kill switch installed in her psyche. The trigger phrase that, when spoken directly to her, would activate the conditioning and strip her of her power instantly. Kneel before the Dragon of Zakul, words designed to reduce her to helplessness on command, whenever she became inconvenient. The adult Vaylin that the Outlander encounters is brilliant, ferociously powerful, and genuinely incapable of empathy. Her Horizon Guard, the elite unit she handpicks as personal protectors after becoming Empress, operates under what the Codex records describe as an unofficial motto, whispered among the knights: "I serve for life, but I don't serve for long." Her temper is volcanic and completely unpredictable. One of her first acts as Empress is violently purging the entire cadre of knights who had protected Arcan. She kills people in her own inner circle for minor irritations. The restraint that even Arcan occasionally exercised is simply absent in her. During the Knights of the Eternal Throne story, the Outlander follows Vaylin back to Nathema, because after Valkorion's apparent death, with his hold over her conditioning weakened, she goes back to break her chains completely. She willingly submits herself to Jarek's machine, the Brain, the device that killed every other test subject, because freedom from her father's control matters more to her than survival. The machine malfunctions when it connects to her raw power. The whole sanitarium shakes. She endures it anyway, screaming in pain, unleashing waves of force energy that crack the building's foundations, fighting through the machine's power with nothing but the stubborn refusal to stay chained in the place she hated most. And she wins. She breaks free, walks out of the sanitarium under her own power, and remotely destroys the entire building from her flagship on the way out. Vaylin is the only person ever to walk out of that sanitarium alive. A child put through years of conditioning, specifically designed to break her, who grew up with a kill switch in her own mind, who spent her entire adult life operating at a fraction of her actual power. And when she finally decided she was done with it, she walked back into the worst place she had ever been, submitted to a machine that killed everyone else who touched it, and tore her own chains off from the inside. Valkorion himself, watching from inside the Outlander's mind, confirmed it after she broke free. She was now more powerful than anyone could imagine. Potentially, he acknowledged, more powerful than even him. The tragedy of Vaylin is inseparable from the tragedy of what Vitiate made her. In another life, she might have been one of the most extraordinary people the galaxy had ever produced. It is 3630 BBY. The Alliance has fought its way to Zakul. Arkan is fighting alongside the Outlander now. His redemption arc complete, his mother Senya by his side. The man who spent years as the galaxy's tyrant, now pointing himself at the thing that made him that way. Vaylin is the last obstacle between the Outlander and the Eternal Throne. They find her on the spire, and the fight that follows is everything you'd expect from the most powerful, unrestrained Force user alive. Volcanic, catastrophic, the kind of battle that leaves structural damage in its wake. Vaylin at full power, with her conditioning shattered, is terrifying. The Outlander defeats her. The law is clear. It's a battle, and Vaylin fights until she has nothing left. When she falls, the last thing she experiences is Senya reaching for her. Her mother, who she had spent years trying to kill, who she had been conditioned to see as an abandonment rather than a rescue, there at the end. Whether something got through in that final moment is left deliberately ambiguous by the law. Vaylin dies on the spire of Zakul with her mother's voice in her ears, and then everything gets significantly worse, because the moment Vaylin dies, the Eternal Fleet, which recognized her as Empress and took its operational commands from her, suddenly has no master. A masterless armada of automated warships with no standing orders except a general directive to protect the Eternal Throne starts doing what automated warships without oversight do. They rampage, bombarding planets indiscriminately, tearing through populated systems. The Eternal Fleet, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, is now essentially a natural disaster. The only way to stop it is for someone to physically sit on the Eternal Throne and assert control. And the Outlander is the only person alive who can do it. So they fight their way up the spire. Arkan alongside them, Senya holding the rear, running battles through corridors full of knights who haven't gotten the memo that their Empress is dead. They reach the throne room. They sit down. And for exactly one moment it feels like it might be over. Then Vitiate drops the act entirely. Suddenly, the collaborative voice in the back of the Outlander's head that has been offering helpful advice for the past several months reveals what it actually is. The patience expires, the performance ends, and Vitiate, in his own words to the Outlander, explains that he has been toying with them, that their curiosity entertained him, that he wanted to understand what made their mind resist him, and now that he does, the experiment is over. He takes over. The full possession that failed when he first transferred, the one the Outlander's will had been resisting for the better part of a year, finally completes at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. Reaching for the Eternal Throne, attempting to absorb the commands of an entire automated fleet, requires a kind of outward focus that creates an opening. Vitiate drives through it. The Outlander's consciousness gets ripped out of their own body and thrown into the abyss of their own mind. Their body sits motionless on the throne. Whatever is looking out of those eyes is not the person their companions know. The mindscape, the interior mental landscape where the real fight happens, takes the form of the Eternal Throne Room. But wrong, corrupted. Vitiate's will reshaping the architecture, the space itself bending toward his presence, the way everything he touches eventually bends. Being thrown into your own mind and finding it redecorated by someone who has been living in it for months is about as violating as it sounds. But he left something in there. The Dramath holocron, the device holding his father's tortured spirit for over 1,000 years, found by the Outlander during the earlier mission, sits at the top of the stairs leading to the mental throne. In the mindscape, it's an anchor. Finding it, reaching it, gives the Outlander something to hold on to amid the corruption, a connection to identity, a tether back to themselves. Outside in the physical throne room, Arkan makes a decision. Senya is fighting off sky troopers who have breached the room, a whole squad pouring in, while the Outlander's body sits empty on the throne. Arkan picks up the physical holocron and meditates on it. He enters the mindscape alongside the Outlander, the son who spent years as his father's instrument, who killed his own twin in a moment of Vitiate's manufactured rage, now inside someone else's mind, fighting the thing that built him into a weapon. Vitiate absorbs Valen's spirit. This is the move he had been preparing since the moment she died on the spire, holding her power, waiting for this moment. Her strength added to his own, reaching back toward the full magnitude of what he was before the hero of Tython damaged him. He sends her enslaved spirit against the Outlander inside the mindscape. His daughter, even in death, still a weapon pointed wherever he aims it. The Outlander fights her spirit and wins. Vitiate restores her and sends her again. And the Outlander does something different this time. Using the Dramath Holocron's ability to bind and release spirits, they reach into Valen's enslaved consciousness and pull her free of her father's control. Arkan speaks to his sister directly, reminding her of their childhood on Zakul, the swamps, Thexan, everything Vitiate took from them both. Valen, freed from the absorption slavery, looks at her father, and for the first time in her life, she has a clear choice. She turns on him. The three of them push together. Vitiate absorbs the hit and pushes them all away with a burst of raw power, destroying the holocron in the mindscape. One focused blast that shatters the anchor. He tells them plainly, nothing stops him. Not his broken family, not the stranger he moved into, not the children he spent centuries treating as furniture. Then the Outlander speaks the phrase, kneel before the Dragon of Zakul, the conditioning installed in Valen's mind at the sanitarium, the deep psychological mechanism that severed her connection to the Force whenever those specific words were spoken, is now inside Vitiate because he absorbed her. It was woven into her psyche, below the level of identity, installed by his own hand through Jarek's work. And when those words land in the presence of someone carrying Valen's conditioning inside their absorbed consciousness, the mechanism fires. It doesn't know the difference between the daughter it was built into and the father who swallowed her whole. The trigger activates. Vitiate's power shackles. His connection to the Force momentarily cut by the exact same switch he designed to control his own daughter. His words, his engineering, his daughter's stolen soul carrying the vulnerability he put there, burning through his power like a fault line through bedrock. In that window, that cracked open, impossible moment, they hit him with everything. Valen's freed spirit strikes her father with the full force of everything he made her into, reversed. Arkan drives forward with 15 years of manufactured rage finally aimed at the right target. Senya, who joined Arkan's meditation after fighting off the last Sky Trooper, adds her weight. Dramath, Vitiate's own father, imprisoned for over 1,000 years in the holocron the man built to torture him. If his spirit was preserved, self-destructs in a final act against his son. A father trapped for a millennium by his own blood, getting one last shot at the end. The Outlander channels everything simultaneously and drives the blow home. Vitiate's consciousness shatters. Arkan noted afterward that he could no longer feel his father's presence. His original Sith pureblood body on Dromund Kaas was destroyed simultaneously. A being who had been alive for nearly 1,500 years, who consumed a planet and built 2 empires and possessed hundreds of bodies and survived physical death multiple times, was finally, completely, irreversibly gone. Ended not by a weapon built to kill him, ended by a phrase he wrote himself, carried back to him inside the soul of his own daughter. Spoken by the one mind in the galaxy he couldn't consume. Every cage he built came back, every tool he forged from people, his father, his daughter, his son, 8,000 Sith Lords, an entire dead world, redirected and turned against him at the moment that mattered most. The man who spent 15 centuries ensuring nothing could touch him was brought down by everything he had touched. The eternal throne was claimed, the fleet went quiet, and for the first time in nearly 1,500 years, the galaxy had one less god in it. So now that we've walked through the entire story, 1,500 years of existence, 2 dead worlds, 2 empires, and a consciousness that refused to die until someone turned his own daughter's trauma against him. The question I know you've been sitting with this whole time is, where does he rank? Darth Vader, starting with the most iconic. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, the highest recorded midi-chlorian count in history, the most tragic figure in the entire saga. At his absolute peak, Anakin was theorized to be the most powerful Force user who could ever exist. Obi-Wan's assessment, Palpatine's own obsession with his potential, everything points toward what Anakin could have been as something genuinely unprecedented. But the thing about Vader that matters for this comparison, he never got there. The suit cut his potential by somewhere between 40 and 80%, depending on which source you read. His greatest weapon, his extraordinary midi-chlorian count, his raw force sensitivity, was permanently hobbled by the injuries on Mustafar and the life support system that kept him breathing. He was a warrior defined by loss. Powerful, absolutely, one of the most dangerous combatants in the galaxy in his era, but operating permanently at a fraction of what he was supposed to be. Vitiate operated at his ceiling. He spent 100 years researching how to maximize his power, then spent the ritual on Nathema absorbing everything he needed to get there. He never had a Mustafar. He never had a limiting factor imposed from outside. Everything he built deliberately and completely. Against Vader specifically, the comparison isn't really about combat, it's completeness. Vader is a broken masterpiece, Vitiate is a finished one. Darth Sidious, we get to the real debate, because the official Legends sources say two things that appear to contradict each other. Sidious is confirmed as the most powerful Sith Lord in history, and Vitiate is confirmed as history's most powerful dark side master. Both statements are simultaneously true, and the reason they don't actually contradict each other is the most interesting part of this entire comparison. By the time of Nathema, and everything that followed, Vitiate had stopped being a Sith Lord. He transcended the category entirely. The Sith are defined by their philosophy, their code, their relationship to the dark side as a tool for personal power and domination. Vitiate stopped using the dark side as a tool at some point and started becoming it. His goal was not to rule the galaxy, it was to consume it. Sidious in a direct confrontation, lightsaber combat, force lightning, the specific suite of abilities the Emperor of the Galactic Empire was known for, almost certainly wins against Vitiate in his mid-period form. Sidious was a devastatingly precise combatant, one of the greatest lightsaber duelists in history, and Vitiate, by his own admission, was not a particularly skilled duelist. The Revan novel specifically notes he could barely hold a saber properly. If the metric is one-on-one combat performance in a controlled setting, Sidious has real advantages. But that framing misses the point almost completely. Sidious built an empire that lasted about 20 years before it was brought down by a farm boy and 2 Jedi. Vitiate built an empire that lasted over 1,000 years in complete secrecy and then revealed itself at the moment of his choosing. Sidious was killed by his own apprentice in a single moment of emotional decision. Vitiate had already died twice before the confrontation that finally ended him, and both times came back. The question of who wins a fight is almost irrelevant when one of them keeps coming back from death and the other one doesn't. Darth Nihilus. The comparison that doesn't get made enough because Nihilus and Vitiate are operating on genuinely similar mechanics. Both are essentially wounds in the Force. Both drain life to sustain themselves. Both represent the dark side taken to a logical and terrifying extreme. Nihilus consumed KOTOR, an entire planet of Force sensitives, in a single act that was arguably more immediately dramatic than even the Nathema ritual. He was so saturated with hunger that his physical form essentially dissolved into it, his mask and robes the only tangible remnants of whatever he used to be. But Nihilus was a slave to his hunger. He had no plan beyond the next feeding. He was pure consumption with no intelligence directing it, a natural disaster rather than a strategist. Vitiate consumed his planet deliberately, as a calculated step toward a specific goal, with full awareness of the consequences and full intention of what came next. Both are terrifying, but one is a wildfire and the other is an architect. Nihilus burned everything he touched immediately. Vitiate waited 1,000 years and burned specific things at specific times for specific reasons. Darth Revan. This one is personal because Revan and Vitiate are the two most interesting minds of their entire era, and their relationship is the most compelling in the whole story. Revan was the most gifted Force user of his generation, capable of mastering both light and dark side simultaneously in a way that essentially no one else managed. The fact that he broke Vitiate's mental conditioning not once but twice, then delayed the Great Galactic War by 300 years from inside a stasis pod, is one of the most impressive things any individual accomplished in Star Wars lore. But Revan lost. Every time he directly confronted Vitiate, he lost. The first confrontation dominated mentally in seconds. The second confrontation overwhelmed and imprisoned for 3 centuries. Revan is the closest thing to a peer Vitiate ever encountered, and even Revan wasn't quite there. What makes Revan extraordinary is that he was the only person who ever made Vitiate genuinely work for it, whoever introduced real friction into his plans, whoever made the most patient being in the galaxy actually wait longer than intended. That's a remarkable achievement, but it's still a loss. Darth Bane. Bane is fascinating because his legacy outweighs his personal power by an enormous margin. The rule of 2, 1 master, 1 apprentice, the Sith philosophy that produced Sidious and Vader 1,000 years after Bane himself was dead, is the single most influential strategic decision in Sith history. Without Bane's insight, the Sith stay a chaotic brotherhood of darkness that the Jedi keep dismantling. With it, they build toward a single perfect strike that brings down the entire Republic. Bane and Vitiate diverge in a way that's almost philosophical. Bane believed in the Sith Code. He believed in the idea of the dark side as a philosophy, as a framework for achieving power and eventual victory. He was building towards something for the Sith as a concept. Vitiate didn't care about the Sith at all. He used them as raw material. The entire Sith Empire he rebuilt was, by his own admission, a side project, a means to an end. Bane would have found that insulting, which is probably why Vitiate would have found Bane useful for about 50 years and then drained him like everything else. In terms of raw power, Bane doesn't approach Vitiate. He's an extraordinary force user of his era, a master of lightsaber combat and Sith sorcery, but he exists in a completely different weight class. What makes Bane legendary is his mind and his legacy, not his force potential. Vitiate had both the mind and the power. Bane only had the mind, and he made it count. Respect.